tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We'll move on to another subject here. I said we talk about LNG. So this has become a bit of a hobby horse for me because I love when you have, on one hand, Justin Trudeau will get up there and say there's no business case for LNG export. And then, as I've joked in the past, and it keeps happening, Vassy Kapelos will interview all these foreign heads of government and heads of state that come to Canada, like the Prime Minister of Greece and I forget it was the Prime Minister or President of Spain and the Chancellor of Germany, and, ask all of them about LNG. And they're all like, oh, yeah, we'd love to buy Canadian LNG. So there is actually a market. There is a business case. One of the holdups, though, has always been the limitation of refineries and export terminals. Well, we have an export terminal at long last nearing completion in British Columbia. So I think it's time to have a bigger picture discussion about the future of LNG. Philip Cross is back. It's been a little while, but it's always good to have him on the show. He is a senior fellow with both the Fraser Institute and Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and had an interesting piece about this in the Financial Post. The figures show Canada needs more LNG projects. Philip, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thanks for having me back.
So where does this argument that there's no business case come from? Because every time you see people lining up to buy it, that strikes me as a pretty compelling business case.
Well, it certainly doesn't come from the business community. And as you noted, it doesn't come from our potential customers overseas who were very anxious to access Canadian LNG. The idea that it's not economic only seems to occur in the head of our prime minister and perhaps some bureaucrats who don't know anything about business cases. But clearly there isn't just a business case, there is an outstanding business case. It's been proven by the Americans who built any number of LNG terminals and made a fortune exporting from them to Europe at the peak of when LNG prices hit extremely high levels just after Putin's invasion of Russia. But there also are opportunities in Asia, and that's the main advantage is we're going to get a higher price for a product we're already producing. Instead of selling it for a very low price to the United States, we can access prices overseas. So it's not even clear that it's going to have a major impact on emissions or any of that.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is that when Canada exports LNG or Canadian oil and gas in general, it allows other countries that are not as quote unquote green, realizing that's a loading term, to have an alternative to, say, coal. And one of the things that has always been missing from this discussion from a lot of people is that emissions are a global calculation, not a domestic one. Mm-hmm. So and I've heard Michael Binion of the Modern Miracle Network make this point that, we could increase emissions in Canada and have a net reduction of emissions globally if we allow Canadian energy, which is produced with very high standards, to access the international market. But that part's missing. And there's so many barriers that are put up really by ideology towards Canada being a major player on this market, it seems.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more about the global emissions. I mean, I have to laugh. I heard on the local radio station this morning driving into Ottawa that Ottawa is finally conceding that it's not going to achieve its target of a 43% reduction in emissions. Well, my goodness, I can't imagine anything more pointless than calculating the emissions at the local level.
Global warming in the city boundaries of Ottawa is going to be one way, and then once you get out, it'll be different. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a purely theoretical calculation anyways, even at the national level. In fact, I'll be writing about this in an upcoming op-ed in the Post about how, when we measure emissions, there isn't somebody from Stackhand doesn't go outside and measure something or stand on top of the Coates building and start measuring, emissions. It's a theoretical calculation. Emissions in this country, for example, blew through the roof last year when we had all those forest fires. And yet that doesn't enter into the official calculation. So the whole business of calculating emissions is very vague and model-based at the best of times. But, the broad lines are that we can be sure that LNG from BC is going to have lower emissions than coal being burned in China. So if emissions are your only focus, it's still a no-brainer.
how much does, I mean, if it's possible to even quantify, but how much does investor confidence and investor tolerance wane on these sorts of projects when you see activists that in some cases very successfully disrupt these things? Because I know there have been a couple of isolated examples where companies have said, listen, this just isn't worth the hassle anymore.
Well, they certainly have had an impact. I mean, Kinder Morgan got out of the oil pipeline business for Trans Mountain because the fears about the delays. I was just reading the Stephen Mayer's book about Justin Trudeau, in which he talks about how Premier Horgan out in BC, he wasn't that opposed to pipelines. He certainly wasn't opposed at all to LNG. He let that one go ahead. But he was just worried. He wanted to keep his coalition together, and he was worried about environmental activists disrupting the work sites and embarrassing the government. So, the militant environmentalists do have an impact and have a disproportionate and excessive voice in determining whether these projects go ahead or not.
So what's happening now? Because you noted that there's already been, since the I think it was the Kitimat project was basically nearing completion, that there's already been a bit of a resurgence in discussions about others.
Well, and not just because we've finally completed one in Canada. I mean, only in Canada.
It took us way longer than it should have.
One project, and let's break out the champagne. But it's a combination of a project finally being completed here in Canada, but at the same time, the Biden administration has given in to their environmental lobbyists and have temporarily frozen any issue of permits for any new projects. Now, there's several projects already underway in the U.S. that will continue to go ahead. So it's not like there's a moratorium, like they imposed on the Keystone Pipeline. But nevertheless, it's an indication that particularly if Biden should get reelected and next year or later this year, and then doesn't care about getting reelected again, and therefore gives into the environmental lobby even more, that there may be a real opportunity for Canada to gain back some of the very large amount of market share that we've lost to the U.S. in developing LNG up to now. So, but these projects take decades to get the permitting and the building done. So it's something we have to start on right now. We can't wait for another administration in the U.S. to come and go before we decide, oh yeah, maybe there's a market here. I think what happened in Europe, with the German chancellor and so on, coming over here in a panic, shows that you have to have that capacity ready well ahead of emergencies. You never know when emergencies are going to come along or when extraordinary events will happen. And so it's best to have the capacity in place and be ready for them.
Yeah, and one of the biggest, I think, counterpoints when Olaf Scholz, so I think, triggered the discussion of this, certainly from the perspective of the business case aspect of it. When that came up, one of the arguments that was made by critics of Canadian LNG or of expanding it was, well, yeah, I mean, if we started it, way back, sure, but the whole point is we couldn't do anything now to serve what he's wanting now. So when you hear that argument happening, it's like, well, great. Well, that means, the best time was yesterday, but the second best time is today.
Yeah, and at one point, when LNG Canada finally went ahead, it was part and parcel of what were at the time 20 project proposals. Now, some of them were just never going to go, were just flyers. But clearly there was serious commercial interest in developing several of them. And some of them needed to be in the East Coast to access the European markets. Most of the discussion now is on the West Coast to access Asian markets. We should diversify. I mean, the important thing to understand in all of this is that right now we are landlocked into just the U.S. market for basically all of our oil and gas. We have to, and as a result, the Americans, not being stupid, pay us very low prices, knowing that we don't have an alternative. We need to access overseas markets. It will get us a better price, and it will give these overseas markets a diversified source of supply, and they won't just be held hostage by the Americans. So it's in everybody's interest to diversify, to access higher prices. And to do that, you have to build capacity, and you have to do it preferably on both coasts. But there's any number of proposals out there on both coasts. Businesses have indicated that they're willing to. I mean, even if some politicians think that there isn't a business case, as long as businesses are willing to take the risk and absorb the losses, I don't know why it's any business of anybody except them. And as long as firms are willing to take that risk, I think it's in our national interest to diversify our markets and get higher prices.
Very well said. Philip Cross, Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, author of this great piece in the Financial Post that we were talking about here, the title of which is "The Figures Show Canada Needs More LNG Projects." Philip, good to talk to you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.